Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. This is Nickel at Noon, and we're delighted to welcome you here today. We'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. This is Nickel at Noon, the online edition. And once again, we're thrilled to welcome you back. Just a reminder that our programs run almost every Thursday during the term time from 12 to 1. The programs are free. The full program details can be found on our website, listed there. You can also follow us on your favorite social media platform, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, even on YouTube, or you're welcome to subscribe to our mailing list just to connect to one of the Nickel staff or Marla, and we'll make sure that we add you. We are thrilled to welcome you today. My name is Michelle Hardy. I'm a curator with Nickel Galleries and your host. We're joined by Marla Halstead, running the technology in the back end there, and co-host today. We're also joined by members of Nickel and Founders Gallery, Christine Sowiak, who's the chief curator, Marina Fisher, collection specialist, Dick Averns, whatever your title is, Dick, curatorial, everything at the Founders Gallery. And our special guest today is, of course, Gwenessa Lam, who is going to speak about the articulate object. Before I introduce Gwenessa, I'll just remind you that next week, on April the 1st, we're welcoming Nurgul Rodriguez, who will be speaking about her current practice. She's a very busy artist, and we're super glad to have an hour of her time. But today's guest is someone that used to be a neighbor down the road, but has since relocated to beautiful Vancouver. Gwenessa Lam is a contemporary artist and educator. She received her MFA from New York University and a BFA from the University of British Columbia. She's received a number of fellowships, including one to Yaddo, the MacDowell Colony, and the Skowegan School of Painting and Sculpture. After teaching at the Alberta University of the Arts for a few years, she's now associate professor at the Emily Carr University based in Vancouver, British Columbia. Gwenessa Lam's paintings and drawings investigate the intersections of perception, memory, and representations of place. They depict intimate interiors and shadowy objects, all suggesting locations or situations we may come across. Her images explore how memory and history are embodied in everyday objects and experiences of space, and was recently featured in Borderline, the 2020 Biennial of Contemporary Art at the Art Gallery of Alberta in Edmonton in the fall of 2020. In this talk, The Articulate Object, Gwenessa will discuss a recent body of work involving drawing and photography that explores the challenges and possibilities of how history is inscribed within cultural objects. Gwenessa, it's wonderful to have you here, and I will stop sharing and pass the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Christine, and everyone from the Nickel and Founders Gallery. It's a real honor and privilege to spend this time with you and appreciate the invitation. So as Michelle mentioned, I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I find this increasingly important for me to remember where I am physically rooted, to consider the histories and the relationships of the places where we are, especially when we are gathered here online. I have been thinking of the words of Robin Wallkimmer, renowned plant ecologist and writer, sharing from her deep knowledge of the importance of connectivity, connectivity to the lands we are on and the relationships that tie us together. She describes this beautifully in her writings on black ash baskets, where she imagines the weaving process as the framework for how our society can be built. She writes, now, let me share this quote with you, and feel free to read along with me, if you can see that. The first, so she writes, the first two rows of the basket are the hardest. On the first go round, the splint seems to have a will of its own and wants to wander from the over-under rhythm around the circle. The second row is almost as frustrating. The spacing is all wrong and you have to clamp the weaver in place to get it to stay. But then there's the third row, my favorite. At this point, the tension of over is balanced by the tension of under, and the opposing forces start to come into balance. The give and take reciprocity begins to take hold, and parts begin to become a whole. So Robin Wallkimmer elaborates on the significance of the three rows as a way to think about how ecological, material, and human relationships are interwoven, and the resilience that comes when the parts are unified in this matrix. The teachings of reciprocity, a weaving of relations, is a needed reminder when we are physically, psychologically, and culturally divided. Today's talk is a unique experience for me in that I am going to discuss a body of work I started before the pandemic, but it was completed and added to while I was in lockdown. So it bridges an intense period of change in how our world has come to operate, and changed in how I have been thinking. So I titled this talk after a recent body of work, The Articulate Object, which Michelle mentioned. I was grateful to have been part of the Alberta Biennial, the Borderlines, and was really grateful to work with an amazing curatorial team there. And thinking of how historical and archaeological objects speak of cultural narratives that carry the past into the present. But what the pandemic and recent conversations have shifted for me is to move from the position of articulation as an act of speaking to the position of listening. In particular, I've been asking, whose voice do we give ear to? And are we willing to listen to voices we do not understand? What is the sensitivity of our ears in hearing about our relationship to the past and present? So in revisiting this project with you, I hope to listen anew to these objects, to reweave the narratives around and between them, and to imagine alternate histories. The focus of my talk will be on three archaeological case studies, which I use as the basis for this body of work. And so I'll show you a few research images first and disperse throughout to share my process, and then transition to the bulk of the works themselves. Okay, so some rough images here. So about I would say 2 to 3 years ago, I began collecting stories of unidentified artifacts that were found off the coast of British Columbia, where I grew up. And I was interested in these objects, not only for what they were, but what they provoked and inspired. Because these objects had no confirmed origin, they became a blank slate for anyone to imagine where they came from. Many of these objects were pots, as well as Chinese coins. So they were thought to have come from Asia, like from ocean drift or left by early Chinese mariners. This is a map. And as I was collecting stories of unknown artifacts from various news articles, I was also introduced to the myth of Fusang. And this is a 7th century tale describing the travels of a Buddhist monk Huishan, who was believed to have visited the coast of the Americas in the latter part of the 5th century. And Fusang was the name given to the land where Huishan had traveled. There's little historical and archaeological evidence of the monk's journey. However, the few ancient Chinese urns and coins that I mentioned earlier are often cited by amateur archaeologists as proof of early encounters between indigenous and Chinese communities related to Fusang. So partly in response to this myth, I began to think of ways in which these yet to be identified objects allowed for possible histories to exist. As long as something is uncategorized, it generates more questions, new discussions, perhaps that weren't considered before. So what if this monk had arrived and other chance encounters had existed? And to be clear, Fusang is speculative, but archaeologists do believe objects can travel via trade and ocean currents from seemingly disparate origins. And this keeps the speculative theories alive, although Fusang is still rather more of a rumor or a myth. And that, I think, that shifted and became my question, in a question that drove much of my work, in how can I engage in that moment of not knowing as a means of thinking through our past to form something yet to be imagined. At that time, I had been visiting the Royal BC Museum in Victoria and was provoked by that question of whether there were any unsolved mysteries in existing museum collections. And that was when I met Grant Keddy, who's the curator of the archaeology department there. And he led me to this small ceramic head that was found near Saturna Island. And this figure became one of the 3 case studies I started to examine to understand how an unidentified object comes to be identified, and sometimes incorrectly so. So here's another image. And so this is an image from the Alberta Biennial, the Borderlines exhibition. So the narrative surrounding the Saturna Island figure and other archaeologists or other archaeological objects culminated in this installation of drawings and photographs titled The Articulate Object. And this work brings together various historical artifacts that are connected through correspondences, archaeological papers, and museum records, and the attempt to tease out the origins of these objects. And it started as a visual index of sorts of the possible trajectories that an object could take when we try to map out its provenance. This is a detail of the wall on the left. So each of the drawings and the photographs are grouped into clusters based on one of the yet to be identified or misidentified artifacts found along the West Coast. So it's a bit of a explanatory note here, some moving parts. So as I mentioned, there are 3 sort of case studies, and so they're visually broken up in that way. So this is a view of just the drawings, and there's a parallel grouping on the adjacent wall with the photographs. The 3 clusters reflect the 3 case studies. So one, I don't know if you can see my mouse here. Can you see my little cursor? Okay. So one is the Saturna Island ceramic figure, which is here. So this would be the first cluster, which I'll talk about, and the Saturna Island figure is here. And the second case study is a coin here and an Aleutic stone lamp, as well as a Votive Buddha figure, which I'll unpack as well. And lastly is the Ruby Creek stone figure on the left. And it's more of a standalone rather than a grouping, which I'll also elaborate the reasons for that in a few minutes, or later on, I should say. So that will give you like an overall structure. And here's a detail of the first cluster on the far right. So the arrangement, connectivity, and proximity of the images became important to me to reflect on the loose connections between objects. And again, they are not tied together through a strict chronological lineage per se. So I want to make sure I'm not making false claims, but rather through conversations and letters between several curators and academics that span several decades. So if we look at the Saturna drawing cluster here, on the bottom, you will see this, here a little here, you'll see this drawing of the actual object in question. And it was based on a photograph of how it was initially discovered on the shore, encrusted with barnacles. And the ceramic head was found in 1949 by David Scott, who was a young boy at the time. And his mother, Emma Scott, later brought it to the Royal BC Museum in Victoria. And through the museum's accounts, a series of letters travels back and forth between several curators, from the American Museum of Natural History to the Tokyo National Museum and others. And so similarly, the speculation, so as these letters are fluttering back and forth, the speculations on the provenance of the Saturna figure also pings back and forth, like between Japan, like could it be, and so the image you'll see on here, the Haniwa figure in the upper left, that's one connection they think is it goes into Haniwa figure, or pings back to potentially the region of New Mexico to resemble a Tasuki rain god on the upper right. So getting a little closer so you can see a bit of the texture. So what's interesting is that through these letters, the messy, inchoate process of thinking through new discoveries is made transparent. Declarations are made, but then promptly corrected. The curators and academics that contradict one another or are redirected down another path. In some letters, the curators are certain it is Japanese, but later on, that theory is overthrown by virtue of its size or some of the facial features. And so these correspondences show how the categorization of historical objects is not fixed and sometimes never come to fruition. As with the Saturna figure, we still don't know quite where it has come from. But what I found intriguing with the Saturna head is it indirectly asks, what would an object from Japan and New Mexico look like? Why limit us to one location? And of course that, it makes sense that the job of the archaeologist is to find that specificity. But from an artist's point of view, I'm always thinking about the cracks of, well, can we consider the another way of thinking? And even if it's not true, like this question sets up a set of relationships that makes me think differently of all three objects through the speculative network. And could there be an object that bridges the two traditions? Could the Saturna figure be its surrogate in some way? Okay, so this, I wasn't able to find a good quality. So this is actually a drawing of a Tasuki a figure, but the reproduction wasn't as good. So I found sort of equivalent or contemporary from a different collection. So this is an example of a sort of from that same region, a Tasuki figure from the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. The other one is from the Royal, the museum in Victoria, the Royal BC Museum, many royals. So this is from the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. And looking at this image, the possibility of the Saturna figure to resemble two distinct ceramic traditions, right? So we went from potentially a Japanese reference to one from New Mexico. I think, the references of those and many other different traditions, it becomes more complicated when we actually look at not only its form, because that's an interesting thing. Most of the original correspondences we're just looking at, the mouth looks like this, so it must resemble that. But if one were to unpack the context and the uses of these references, in this case, the Tsuki, and later on the Haniwa figures, they're very, very different, even though the appearances may overlap. And so to date, the recent conclusion is that, like, between these two regions of possibilities, the Saturna figure may be closer. They think it's closer to the Tsuki figure in terms of its form. The early Tsuki figures, however, were made. This one was made in, I think, 1895, but many of them were made in the 1900s to 1940s or slightly earlier. And they're referred to as rain gods, but they don't have a direct connection to more culturally rooted representations of Mayan or Aztec rain gods. And I'm not an expert, so later on, please feel free to correct me if anyone has more in-depth knowledge. But these clay forms were actually made as souvenirs for tourists. And so that was something I found quite interesting. And they were often sold with chocolates as prizes in the boxes. And they're still made today, but they're much more elaborately painted. And so as a product made for the West and for consumption, this adds a very different dimension and stands in contrast to the clay forms of Japan. So, if you think of it was, potentially a Tsuki, but then if we toggle over to the Haniwa, so this is the Haniwa from the British Museum from the 6th century. This was the other reference it possibly could have been, but now they believe it's not. The Haniwa are actually clay figures, and sometimes they're animals, but they were installed in burial sites, right? So very completely different context. And they played a role in the rites and farewells to those who had died. So to set up a relationship between the Saturna figure, still our enigmatic mystery object, and the Haniwa or Tsuki figures, it brings together like drastically different purposes and context, though they appear connected in their shape and form and material. So I guess what I'm trying to share is, I think, the complexity of the narratives that comes in making an association between these distinct traditions. And again, this is purely speculation. This is not what archaeologists are saying. But again, the pairing and suggestions of these references to me reflects upon not only the limits, but the possibilities of archaeological mismatches, which I'm always interested in. So, so that was sort of one of the first artifacts that drew me into this line of thinking, and more started to accumulate as others brought examples to my attention. And so the second case study, as we move along the wall to the center, is one of more of misidentification, but that comes to be like there's I guess you'd say a resolution. It comes to be corrected over time. So on the left is an Aluptique stone lamp, now in Alaska. And on the top is a Chinese coin from the Ming Dynasty. And they were found from the same archaeological site. And on the bottom left is a votive figure of a Buddha that's from an unrelated collection, but potentially from the same time period. And that's my sort of artistic license. I put that in as a reference, which I'll unpack. So the stone lamp and the coin are currently in the collection at the Alaska State Museum in Juneau, and but they were found, I believe, in Alaska, in that region. And according to their documents, what was interesting with these two objects is that the presence of one object led to the misidentification of the other. So, and so they were found in close proximity to each other. They knew the coin was Chinese, but the stone lamp, they were not quite sure of. And so early documents mistakenly identify what they call an oriental stone lamp with a Buddha-like figure in the center. And the museum now correctly identifies it as a Aluptique after consultation with knowledge keepers and indigenous scholars. And there may have been a relationship between the objects, but only in the sense that the owner, it could have been the same owner of the coin who also was in possession of the stone lamp, but they're understood to be from very different regions in terms of its provenance and where it was originally created. So the Votive Buddha, which I mentioned, was sort of my addition to the installation, was not from the original archaeological site. But for me, it was more of a suggestion or a test of this hypothesis that based on the original text. If we were to compare an actual Buddha figure with what was believed to be the bowing Buddha figure in the stone lamp. So what I've included on the left is an image courtesy of the Alaska State Museum in Juneau. And they provided these wonderful images of details of the actual stone lamp, which you see here. And so it also, so to me, the pairing of the two was interesting. You know, to think about the speculation and previous myths, that it becomes the Buddha drawing, the votive figure of the Buddha becomes a placeholder for the myth of Fusang. If we were to imagine, which is what they had previously thought, that the objects may have had a connection to Asia. Okay, so then we circle back to the gallery view, and so you know, we began with the Saturna figure, you know, the case study of an object that were possibly between two regions, and then looking at the case of a mistaken identity with the Lutic stone lamp. And so again, I'll show you the equivalents on the photo wall, right? So as I was saying, the clusters are similarly mapped on the adjacent wall. So here's the Saturna. We talked about the coin and the stone lamp. And there's a bit of an adjustment where instead of the Buddha figure, I sort of swapped them, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The last sort of case study is more of the singular image that is set apart, and mostly due to how differently it was written about and studied when compared to the other artifacts. And so here's a more detailed shot. And this is the Ruby Creek stone bowl figure from the back view. And it was found in Ruby Creek in BC, just north of the Fraser River. And unlike the other objects, it has not been compared to any other figures of bowls directly found in its region or abroad. And unlike the other images, I also chose not to draw it from the front, because based on many studies, in particular one by an archaeologist, they had paid greater attention to the back side rather than the face, the frontal side, in attempts to determine its provenance. So that became interesting to me, and I'll show you why. And so here's a detail. So what you're seeing here are two detailed images of the photographic images from the Royal BC Museum. And they're details showing the textures of the artifact and the courtesy of the Royal BC Museum and Grant Keddy, who's the archaeologist I had worked with. And so you can see the magnification of the textures on the right. And I'll just minimize my, if it makes a difference. Sorry, so you can see the magnification of the textures on the black and white image there about 20 times. So what I found remarkable about the literature on this figure is the focus is less on the morphology or features as in previous case studies. Instead, it's centered on the markings on the back and how it was made. The lines on the back indicate it must have been made with an iron file or tool, like just based on the strikes and the sort of length of the lines, and to create those types of marks. This observation is significant because it immediately narrows down the possibilities of its origins. and it restricts it to time periods or situations when iron was available. And so that leaves us with three possibilities. One, that it was made between the 1700s or to 1900s when iron tools were developed or made available in that region. Two, it was possibly made earlier by indigenous carvers who procured the iron through trade or shipwrecks. Three, lastly, it may have been carved overseas, but arrived here through trade or shipwreck as well. And so until we can date the object or do a material analysis, we still don't know which of the three is most accurate. And it's still another mystery to be solved. But this particular artifact, being the last in this series, was also seminal in shifting the way I'm thinking about how we look at and identify objects. I think this shift in approach to look at the archaeological objects through its materials, its process and use, in parallel to its morphology and or form, I think opens up a more complex series of questions. And I'm constantly reminding myself, like, to ask, who are we assuming knowledge for? And do our questions open up or close down possibilities for understanding? Just advance here. So the desire to multiply and open up understanding, is key throughout, like trying to understand and honor the histories of these objects. But it also very much informed my process in making these works. And so I've dedicated most of my time in talking about the content of these works so far. And this is a shift I've been doing in terms of doing justice to the objects themselves. But the mediums and the process, of course, were influenced by what they were and the ideas like driving the research. So as I mentioned, the clusters of images exist in two forms. So we have the drawings and the photographs adjacent on the right. And this was done as a way to complicate its representation. But they aren't exact replicas or mirrors of one another. And so this is where there's some unpacking required. And so to share the process with you, what I went through, I began with the drawings first, so the drawings on the left, and I drew them pixelated. So that's something I always have to clarify when I'm doing a presentation online, because it's not your screen, or it may be, oops, sorry, just, phone is just, it's just a problem when you use your phone as the timer as well. Bells ringing. So the drawings were, so as I was saying, they actually are pixelated. So they're I drew them pixelated. And this was also partly due to the fact that, like, my current access to these objects is through a screen. And that was important for me to acknowledge this in the work as well. And the drawings then were scanned and inverted like a negative to create the larger photograph, which you see here. And there's a detail on the right. So the inversion is more noticeable in the photograph, because you have the white eyes, and it almost appears like a thermal scan where the light seems to glow from within. So you can do, I chose this one because I think it's the most apparent, where you can sort of deduce where the areas from the dark areas from the drawings then become light in the photograph, if that makes sense. So, that was really important to start with the drawing, and they aren't just simply replicating in the photograph. There is this inversion process, which I talk about, that becomes crucial in not replicating the image, but representing the image in a photographic form. But if you look again, so I'm always interested, trying to find ways to sustain the viewer and to engage them. If you look closely, though, you'll notice that not all of the photographs appear quote unquote normal, right? You'll notice that there are photographs that appear normal. They don't all have that glow or solarization that I just showed you. Some of them just appear like regular photographs. And that's because they were actually drawn differently. And so in fact, so I'll share with you the second phase. So what I had done was I selectively drew some of the objects as quote unquote positive images first. So when they're inverted in the photograph, they had that halo or thermal glowing. So the one that you saw previously, was just like a quote unquote normal photo. So when you invert it, it starts to look otherworldly, right? But there are ones, it's more subtle. When you look at the photo, they just look normal. And that's because if you look closely, the drawing, the other half of the drawings were, as I said, they were drawn as negatives. So if you see here, so again, when you take them into the photographic process, they actually become positive prints, right? They lack that strange glow. So the selection criteria in how I created the drawing was such that, so what I was like, okay, how did I decide which ones are, I drew roughly half of them as like normal, like as you would see it, and others I also made them as like a type of negative. So what I decided was that the unidentified, sort of the mystery, the misidentified objects were the ones that I drew them as negatives, like you see here, this eternal one, right? But as a drawing, it still is convincing. It's not as obvious. But the idea is that, if they start as a negative, they're not fully realized until they're seen as positive photographs and until it's in the photographic form. So does that make sense? I hope that I can elaborate later, because I think this is a crucial point that it's hard to explain it until you see the work. But the key point is that there's a distinction between the drawings and the photos, and even within the drawings themselves, the inversion happens to different degrees. So the gesture is admittedly subtle, but it was motivated by questions of representation. In disciplines requiring documentation that are part of data collection, I think the photographic image still stands as significant as like the final proof and verification that something has transpired, that something isn't real until it's documented and captured. And I'm exploring this from an archaeological and scientific point of view, where the camera is one of many tools used to record and share information. But now that we're all online, it is also a central access point, to be able to experience historical artifacts remotely, right? It's like through the screen and the virtual collection. So that's like an added lens that this work has taken since the pandemic. So to show the drawings with the photos reveals the transformation that happens, I think, between different media. They all refer to the same set of objects, but the tactility and affect changes one's relationship to the images. When you look at the drawings, they are different from the experience of the photographs. And so this is my last image. So throughout this body of work, I've been thinking about representation, but always in the context with the narratives and histories that each object carries. Each one has such a singular context and reference, yet when brought together, even if erroneously, they also can't help but form a speculative relationship. So the articulate object may in fact be more about articulation as a noun rather than a verb. And so what I mean is, it's not an articulation of words per se, but of limbs. It's a structure, a conjoining of images from disparate parts and places. And so my hope is that this coming together forms a different weave of relations, possibly generating new associations and ways of connecting our histories. And thank you for listening. I'll stop my screen share here.
Thank you, Gwenessa. And given that both Dick and Christine have to run off, should we start with Dick's questions? Quick, Dick, you're still here. Do you want to just speak?
Sure, just unmute myself. So yeah, thanks ever so much. Really engaged with the cultural and academic layering that you're putting here. So yeah, my question number one was from your title of the talk, The Articulate Object of Relational Weave. It seems to have strong relationships to other notable art writings, the amenable object and also relational aesthetics. So I'm wondering what correlation you might share with us on how your work overlaps with either of those theories or authors.
No, that's a good question. Those are definitely on my list. This has been a new turn for me in thinking about the works in this way. So I haven't made a direct reference to those. I was thinking it more in terms of the historical and cultural references and how they begin to impact each other in comparison to those. But you know, that is something that is a different way, and I think something that I would like need to expand upon and pursue. But I think those, you know, those references are very much I think probably like the next like step to expand on that. I mean, I'd be interested to hear, Dick, if there's like a specific aspect you see that I could help tease out a bit more, like within those theories.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, Bulliard's relational aesthetics is very much about the content of artwork being born through or carried by relationships of exchange rather than the objects themselves. And so I don't overtly see that necessarily with the way that you've depicted the work, because you've created objects at the end of them, but you are creating a form of aestheticizing uncertain theories. And so I think that that's a possible layer. And with the amenable object, I'm interested how much you're familiar with the amenable object in the first instance, I guess, before I might add anything.
But not as much so. I mean, one thing you're bringing up, which is interesting, because I've been trying to bring in the references in terms of archaeological studies as well. And so I don't know if this sort of is it isn't. This is the thing. This probably is more of a from a new perspective in how archaeology is progressing. But I'm trying to see those relationships to the immutable object. So, for instance, I was listening to an interview by Hayups, who's an elder and a knowledge keeper from the Chana, and it was interesting to hear him speak about rattles and the object in terms of its use value. And so again, very, very different context, but I think it's an interesting, you know, to bring those things together, because you're right, like the work that I'm showing itself does not operate in that way, but I'm interested in engaging in that idea where he speaks of the objects in terms of, as you're saying, and this is like from an indigenous perspective of how they're used, as opposed to simply looking at what they are. If that is sort of
Yep,
a correlation as opposed to
sure,
direct.
certainly from the indigenous perspective. I was thinking more of Jean Randolph's amenable object, if that's on your radar.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking about Jeannie Randolph too. I haven't read that particular one, but I think the work itself, I think I sort of creeps up on it, but I think again it's something I would love to look into as well.
Sure, because what I was specifically thinking of with Randolph's work is that on the one hand, she's talking about found objects, and that's highly relevant to what you're talking about. But on the other hand, she's talking about a kind of reverse psychoanalysis, which is more of a Western construct, and that wouldn't be so relevant. And so then I'm thinking, what kind of you know, psyches or indigenous philosophies would be at play to that might otherwise come into the mix behind the symbolic aspect of the objects that you're handling, which are clearly found objects. So, but I should let Christine jump in if she has a question before I pitch my second question, because I know that she's crunched for time as well.
Yeah, sorry. I'm already unmuted. Thanks. And Gwenessa, thank you very much for the talk and the excavation of all of the layers put into the work. And I think what's outstanding to me is having my own initial understanding of your works proven wrong, because you have incredible drawing skills, and what are your drawings? I assumed were manipulated or altered photographs, because I saw the pixelization in the renderings and that, and just especially through screens made that assumption. So I'm really intrigued, you know, given the weight of the research and theory that are part of these works, on your motivation to spend that much time with the hand, and you know, very personal, very contemplative, and adding in yet another layer to these objects that is that very quiet intervention, and perhaps, I don't know if it's creating a creation of another mythology or story or layer that those objects never could have imagined having for themselves. That probably isn't a question that makes much sense, but it's like adding another story to them.
No, and I think that's a good point too, because one thing I should have added was, and like I said, this is a very different type of presentation that I've done before. And when the exhibitions are installed, I do, when possible, try to include some documentation so that the histories and the narratives that I shared with you are there, but they aren't apparent. So I think what you're pointing out is something that, to me, I'd be negotiating of sort of the richness of what the objects are themselves, but as artists, how do we engage with them? That's what I'm thinking. It's not a, like, what is my intervention in them?
Yeah.
And yeah. And so partly you're correct. I think it is the drawing of it, like that transformation and the placing of them together, like that has increasingly become important, where the work I'm doing now is much more about that, of being able to, is moving actually away from the specificity of the objects and talking about that connection that happens.
Yeah.
But it is important in terms of the hand. To me is also, I'm trying to think of the experience of the viewer, that to see, because they can't see these objects in person, but you know, do these drawings somehow convey something, that, again, that shift between the drawing and the photograph, like between them, which I didn't have a chance to talk about, but what initially motivated it as well was to create the using, you know, the histories of these, well, I shouldn't say using, but sharing the narratives of these objects, like, and to create a photo. To me, it was also a project to try to create a photograph that was also a drawing, if that makes sense. And so the manipulation, the materiality, the experience of it, in a way, is to, I think, give attention to is history that has potentially been neglected or not looked at in that same way. But you're right, I think, in that the entry points for the work is like, one is very much research based, but is also contingent on an experience of the work itself.
Yeah, which is very alluring and resonant, and is that way in that you're talking about for the viewers. So. Yeah,
Yeah, I like that discussion. Can I throw in my second question? I was able to text my appointments and put them off till 10 after or quarter after 1, because I know we started a bit late. So I do have a follow-up to this question, and I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but I'm wondering whether there's other artists that you're familiar with or that you might reference for your choices around reversal of positive and negative in the depictions, or any theories associated with that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, there are quite a few, like the idea of mirroring the reversals. In fact, if I were to look chronologically, and I'm biased here because I had studied with Peter Campus with his earlier video work, and how he had used like the negative. And it's interesting. I think this taps into what you're saying, Dick, earlier about the psychological, how he was using the video format and the reversal. So a lot of his video work and photographic work was looking at imagery in reverse, and some of them were portraits of himself and these moments. And to me, that was seminal because he had done this early on, I think in the 1960s and 70s in his early video work. But also, so that's like an early reference. But moving forward, many photographers are using sort of that thermal lens as a way to capture motions of bodies, and escapes me. So I'm not going to try to mention the name because I'm going to get it wrong. But no, I don't want to butcher the name. But in terms of there is like I think we're all familiar with a use seeing now of artists who have been in a way using, and this is sort of tapping into, I think, the moment we're in of responding to contemporary images. Particularly, I'm thinking in the context of there were stills I know Ai Weiwei had used of using like the thermal imagery to sort of capture night vision, and so those are, I think, all on our sort of part of our daily understanding of what the camera can do. Yeah. So there's those everyday contexts as well as a contemporary art context. Yeah. And to me, I think, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. What your conceptual rationale is, though, for adopting that?
Mm-hmm. So twofold. One is sort of building on what when I had worked with Peter Campus is the reversal it's interesting because it's a mirror. It's a relationship to whatever your referent is, but it's just that slight reversal of values that causes you to take pause, right, to think of what it is that reevaluate what it is that you're looking at. So one is one of almost like this moment of an uncanny or a moment to cause one to take a double take, right? The second is also playing off of the what certain technologies connote for us. So it did resonate in the sense of like when I was speaking with colleagues and talking through this work, right? Like some of the reversals do harken to a particular type of scanning. So then what does it mean to take something, especially some of the objects that seem more intimate and personal, and to submit it to something that seems very clinical? So you have both like a visual jarring to question what it is you're looking at, but secondly, then to also think about the technologies that enact these filters, and to make us aware of how, in a way, either we become used to them or they begin to, I think, shape the way we relate to an image.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm going to slide on, but the others that I was thinking of, I get the symbolic reference of the doubling and the inversion, but I was thinking that you're presenting a kind of monumentality, or that the possibility of some of these objects, they have a monumental quality to them. And Smithson's tour of the monuments at Passaic, New Jersey, although more of a Western approach, he was critiquing the notion of the grand tour, and you're creating a kind of tour, and then he inverted those maps. But the other thing that really came up for me was a kind of inversion of race or identity and ethnicity. So I don't know if you come across Gavin Jantji's coloring books, but I put those in the chat there for you as a follow-up. But thanks,
That's
I
great.
really appreciated your answer.
No, I appreciate these questions, Dick. I have a wonderful reading list to follow up on, so I think you can get an additional lens to think
some of these things are definitely in my area of interest, and don't want to be peppering you too much with the academic, but I'd love to indulge in it. So feel free to reach out if you want to talk about it more.
That would be great. I appreciate that. Thank you.
If I can jump in, I'm thinking a lot about museum processes and the history of, you know, how things like cataloging have changed, how, you know, 150 years ago, how did we record museum artifacts? We drew them. And how did we know them? Because we drew them. And then later on, we started using photography and then other kinds of digital formats to record the surface and sometimes composition of these artifacts. So, you know, I think that the work really kind of, at least to me, speaks to those sorts of transitions. And again, how we know not just those objects, but how we know the past. I also wanted to ask you, Gwenessa, about your decision to show these different objects on just plain white or just plain black backgrounds. Thinking about archaeology and how, you know, during a dig, the context of those finds is absolutely critical. The relationships that those objects have to the space and the place and other kinds of objects is really critical for archaeologists' understanding. But you've edited that out, and I just wondered if you could comment on your decision around that.
No, I think that's a good question too, because it was interesting. Was also thinking about the archaeological object, the historical object, how it exists in that frame. But as I was toggling back and forth because it's interesting how you have the object in the dig, as you said, and then there's moments like depending on the life of the object when it enters in the museum, and then what type of museum. And so I think you're, in a way, this is also a good question, because like I appreciate these Q&As because it informs the next like work that I'm doing, in a sense of you're in that way. I think the way it was installed was actually more like a museum, and I think what I was thinking about was the relationship between the two, that there is this it's almost like in the archaeological dig, right? Like there is that mess, like that context was just so important. And there's something about, and that's true, that's something I am thinking about of the next step of to improve on that the current one is more of like it's clean, almost like cleaned up in some sense, like the context is available, but you know, as documents, but sort of like potentially a comment of what happens to the object post dig. And in that way, what ended up happening is, I think the conversations I had in that context were I think the challenge I had and was thinking about was thinking it from a museological perspective is how, I don't know if this is answering your question, Michelle, but something I've been thinking about is like that sort of with regards to the tensions of how we set up nomenclature, categorization. What I would say is like you're pointing very importantly to how things are shown. And I guess I was thinking more about in that case, like how things are named, where I had a question. So for me, it was through, if you look at the labels in the exhibition, they're very long. I ended up trying to include as much information in the title themselves. And that came about through a conversation I had with a colleague of, in my talk, it took me a while, like I talked about the objects as being objects that were unidentified, and previously I had talked about the objects as unknown. And then she challenged me and saying, actually, they are probably known, but they aren't known to us. And so there's a shift in the sensitivity of museological studies, like to think about how are we naming things or things that we don't know. So I apologize, Michelle, I'm probably not answering your question, but
no, I don't know that there's a right answer, but I think that it's, you know, it's really interesting to reflect on. And, you know, I think that museums, in a sense, we're trying to put that mess back in the picture to acknowledge those relationships and, you know, the uncertainties that surround many of these objects, the fact that we don't have all the answers. So,
yeah. No, and I think, yeah, I think that I think your point actually is important in the sense of, I think I went the other way, which was when these things are stripped of that context, like you just see them as they are, they become something else, and but not to negate that context. So that's like a really good, I think, point that you brought up.
I love visiting the Museum of Anthropology and walking around in their visible storage, and just, you know, you're bombarded by all of these, not random objects, but all these different things that, you know, one, two, and you alluded to this at the beginning with your quote, you know, it's just sort of a random coincidence, but you add that third row of basket weaving and the pattern starts to emerge, it starts to gel. And I think that's really, really interesting. It was a beautiful quote. Marina, did you have anything that you wanted to explore with Gwenessa?
I just want to say I truly enjoy your talk. Thank you so much. And from the historic point of view that particularly interests me, I was very intrigued by your view and exploration of identification of objects and placing them in cultural content and context. I think this is extremely important, and in many cases needs to be really revisited. And we really need to kind of open our minds more and not be afraid to start asking questions. Like, I really love that example that you gave with the coin and the lamp, and how the assumption was made that the lamp was also Chinese, which is what is usually done when the coins are found. The coins are often used as the identifier for objects in the archaeological context. So I really, really enjoy that. And as a numismatist, I'm just going to ask the final question. Do you know the exact dates when, I know you said it was Ming Dynasty, but that's kind of from the, like, what is it, 14th to the 17th century, if you know what is the date of the coin?
Well, this is a strange thing. So I was looking at the records at from the Alaska Museum, and they've dated it as the Ming, but the date is like actually 1900. I don't know if that makes sense to you. So, and there was a question mark in the in the documentation, but I was surprised with that. Like, there were some contradictions where it said Ming Dynasty, and let me see if I can pull it up in my notes. But the actual date they had was 1900, which didn't seem right. But they had a broad range, so like it was like a huge span, and then 1900 was the upper bracket. I don't know if does that make sense to you?
No, not really.
No. Okay, I'll email you the documentation, but I'd be curious to know what you think.
I'm gonna, yeah, please send me the coin. I'm gonna try and see if I can identify it, and maybe at least date it a little bit better.
Okay, that would actually be exciting for me to follow up with an actual.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
There'll be a new story to tell.
Expert,
new
yeah,
relationship.
No, that's great. I will do that. That's my homework today.
Yeah. Well, that, I think, unless you've got anything else, Marina?
No.
No. Thank you so much, Gwenessa. This was so interesting. And Marla's giving us a thumbs up. I really enjoyed having you here and learning more about your work. I'm sorry that, you know, you're no longer down the road. But you know, it would be really great to stay in touch. And if you come back to Calgary and we're open, come and visit us. And the very best with what comes next for you.